Hey everyone out there in YouTube land, it's Adam here with another installment of Differently Wired, the channel where we talk about all things neurodiversity and work to reduce the stigma against neurodivergent individuals. Welcome back everyone. Before we get started today, I just want to take a minute to say thank you to everyone who liked, subscribed, and shared my previous video. Like I said, I'm new to this whole YouTube thing, so it's really awesome to see everyone sharing it so enthusiastically and loving what I did and all that stuff. I can't tell you what that means to me, and I'm very excited to continue with this project, and I really hope I can count on all of you to continue liking, sharing, and supporting as we're going forward. It's amazing, and you all rock, seriously. So the idea for this video actually came from several interactions I've had recently with both friends and family, where I realized that my instinctive, shall I say, go-to responses to certain situations are shaped by my neurodivergence, and are in fact quite different than what neurotypical people expect out of the same interactions. Now, you might notice from my Starfleet uniform and the title of this video that there is nerdery afoot. Fellow nerds might recognize the title reference above and feel something like this.
I understood that reference.
But for everyone who doesn't, just what am I on about? And how does it relate to neurodiversity and communication and all that stuff? To answer that, it's time to get our geek on. But before we get our geek on, I have to note something. This video is primarily about spectrum dwellers who can communicate verbally. There are a whole host of autistic people out there who cannot use spoken language to speak, but that doesn't mean they don't have anything important to say. This goes back to what I said in my first video. Give us the tools to help each other reach our full potentials, but do not try to change us in the process. In cases such as these, facilitated communication, electronic aids like computers and tablets and smartphones, internet connection in general, and other accommodations can help ensure the unique voices of non-verbal autistic individuals are heard on their terms and not anyone else's. Okay, back to getting our geek on. So the second episode of Star Trek The Next Generation's 5th season is called Darmok, and it's centered entirely around communication differences between our intrepid heroes on the Enterprise and the crew of a Temerian ship with whom Starfleet has never been able to chat. You see, the Temerians and the Federation have never been able to open a dialogue, and it's because while the Universal Translator, which is the device in Star Trek that's a plot contrivance and lets everyone speak English without actually speaking English to each other, it translates their words, but it doesn't translate the core structure of their language. The entire structure of their language is built on metaphor and is completely different. It's not that their words are unintelligible, like I said, it's that the way both sides perceive communication is fundamentally different. When Captain Picard and the Temerian captain, for example, are stranded together on an alien world and forced to work together to survive both against the wilderness and in a monster living in a nearby cave, the alien commander continuously and frustratedly repeats, "Darmok and Gilad at Tanagra!" as he desperately attempts to communicate with Jean-Luc. Mon Capitaine, as Q is fond of calling him, scratches his bald head. Seriously, look at this thing and tell me that's not glorious. Responds confusedly wondering what the heck is he talking about. He had no clue, and neither side could communicate effectively with the other. And if this sounds at all familiar, and it should, while fictional in the context of this episode, a very similar situation often unfolds anytime a neurodivergent and neurotypical people try to communicate with each other. In fact, communication differences are one of the big reasons why autism is considered a disability. Autistic people have a hard time understanding the 50 million layers of subtext, hidden meaning, and metaphor hiding just under the surface of most human communication. We really hate that stuff, and the mind games that go with it and everything else. Just tell us what you want and what you mean bluntly and openly and honestly, and we'll do it. And vice versa. Blunt, honest communication is my favorite thing. And likewise, head games are something that I'm a pacifist, but I'd make an exception to punch someone who tries them. Likewise, though, neurotypical people often get frustrated because they feel like autistic people should just get it. Like, why don't you understand the subtle meaning I'm throwing down here about how I really want you to go home and do the dishes, but I'm not saying that openly and clearly, and I'm just expecting you to get it. You don't understand that? This is kind of the problem. So, on that note, though, interesting aside I was thinking as I was writing this video is that meme culture in general represents a mainstream adaptation of autistic communication, because we very much think visually, and the idea that we reference movies and video games and TV shows for communication is such a cliche about autism spectrum disorder at this point. But memes do that. Memes reference images and scenes that everyone knows, much like the Temerians in their metaphorical language in Star Trek, and tells a funny story or makes a humorous comment with them. So in many ways, memes are an adaptation of an autistic inclination that appeals to everyone in the mainstream. So, you're welcome. Honestly, I have been referencing things like the Picard facepalm long before it was a meme, because my brain just instinctively creates memes in my head situationally. To elaborate on this communication differences more, though, going back to the communication differences, I do want to talk a little bit more about some experiences in my own life. My family on my mom's side, I mentioned in my first video, my parents are divorced. My dad remarried. We have a wonderful family, but I'm the kid between two worlds, and that's cool. My mom's side of my family, we're wonderful people, but we're a little bit eccentric, and we always joke that my mom's side of my family is entirely neurodivergent in some form, that autism is basically a family genetic trait. It's really only a half joke, because it's pretty much the accurate case. And there's one area in particular that this is glaringly obvious, and it comes down to how we react to friends and family needing our help as a family when we try to fix things. Now, I know what you're going to say. I can hear you saying it already, in fact. But Adam, that's a boy thing. All men do that. There's certainly a stereotype to that effect, but I have no interest in gendering anything today, especially since I'm going somewhere more spectrum-related with this. You see, from my personal experience anyway, both from my own life and from getting to know other spectrum dwellers, when neurodivergent people such as myself are confronted with friends or family who are going through a rough time, like let's say they confide in you that they're experiencing an anxiety attack, or they're going through depression or anything like that, or they're having a hard time, maybe they're financially destitute or whatever, it could be anything. The logical response that many of us feel is to try to solve the problem, or at the very least to point the person in the direction of solutions that they can apply themselves. I mean, contrary to the long-held notion that there are autistic people and people on the spectrum have no emotion, we actually do. In fact, we feel our emotions dialed up to 11 most times. So in most cases, we also tend to have a high degree of empathic ability. Once we're aware of someone in pain, it can take us a moment or two to figure out that someone is actually hurting, or that something hurt them, or but once it's pointed out to us, we're like, oh my god, I'm so sorry, is everything okay? And we jump in, and we're pretty darn good friends. But we usually want to reduce the pain of our loved ones are feeling by trying to help, and why wouldn't we? I mean, isn't the compassionate and caring thing to do to try to reduce someone else's suffering? I mean, Buddhism is almost entirely focused on the reduction of suffering in this world, so isn't our tendency to want to do that both, logical and merciful? I would think. And yes, I would argue that it is merciful and logical. The problem is, it's not always what neurotypical friends and family want when they confide in us. In a lot of cases, and again, everyone's different, because there are neurotypical people who prefer the help me approach too. But as a rule, I find a lot of neurotypical people, or the neurotypical way of communicating implies that when someone opens up about something they're worried about, angry about, or which otherwise disturbs them, what's expected is that we sit and listen without offering any solutions unless asked. We sit there, we listen, we honor their contribution, we talk to them, that kind of thing. And I mean, it would be seen as rude to them if we do offer something of a solution in that situation. And I've come to understand that logically, and I'm pretty good at doing that. But my first instinct is always to try to help. And that's just part of it, I guess. It's part of who I am. So this is, again, in sharp contrast to two neurodivergent people confiding in each other. Again, not everyone. Where such behavior will typically be seen as expected, appreciated, and even a sign of affection and care that it truly is, if they both offer to try to help each other and find constructive solutions. Again, it's the logical thing to do, and it's the merciful thing to do. So, well, why wouldn't we do it? What is it? What do social norms matter? If we can help each other, we'll help each other. Are either sides of this wrong? No, not in the slightest. Everyone has their approach to dealing with difficulty, and everyone has different things they expect out of communication. But both stand diametrically opposed to each other and create arguments in tense situations almost entirely unintentionally. And it can be messy, and it's not always fun. And I've had moments myself where I said or did something thinking I was helping, and then it exploded in my face like so much Splatoon splatter. I've been playing Splatoon, don't judge me. But basically, it blows up in our faces when there's a disconnect in what both sides want. So going off of that, actually, another thing that differentiates neurodivergent and neurotypical communication styles, in my experience, is that if you're a neurodivergent person and have made it past the wanting to help phase unscathed, you'll probably be tempted to share your own story of pain and trauma in order to help your friend or family member realize that you do, in fact, know what they're going through and what you're talking about, and that they are not alone. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? You don't really want your response to be cliche and hollow and be like, "Yo, that sucks, bro." No one wants that, right? Unfortunately, though, I mean, yet again, neurotypical and neurodivergent folks tend to see this differently. In my own experience, many times, in fact, it's seen as an attempt to appropriate the conversation and make it about you, which is not the intention in the slightest, I assure you. You can kind of understand, though, where someone would think that, because if they're opening up to you thinking, I need my friend's help, and I want someone who will listen to me and talk to me and, validate me, and then we jump in with our own contribution of our own suffering, it might come off as, well, are you just competing with me over who has the worst suffering or what? And that's, again, not the case, but this is where communication breaks down, because both sides have a valid perception of it, but both sides don't see it the same way. And it comes down to fundamental differences between, the autistic brain and the normal brain. Normal, I hate the word normal. Neurotypical brain, because no one is normal. Being mindful of this perceptual difference is something I've had to work on myself, so I know firsthand how difficult it is to wrap your brain around something like this if you are neurodivergent or if you're neurotypical trying to understand our way of doing things. It's almost like talking to a different culture, and I'll get to that in a sec. But before I do, on a more positive note, I want to share this because this is fun. Something I also want to mention here is what's known as info dumping. Remember that thing I mentioned last week, or whenever I last posted the video? I'm losing track of time sometimes.
What year is it?
That thing I mentioned about how when people on the spectrum are excited about something, we really get excited about something and we want to talk about it. That's called info dumping. And it goes hand in hand with how autism is perceived as a communication deficit by neurotypical people, because from a neurotypical perspective, it constitutes dominating the conversation and not knowing when to allow others in to contribute their ideas. And I mean, it can be a problem in that way. Absolutely. If someone has something else that they want to talk to you about or contribute or anything like that, it can be a problem, because when you are info dumping, you need to get all this information out, and someone trying to change the topic of the conversation is annoying in the extreme if you hadn't had a chance to info dump, because gosh darn it, what you have to say has to get out. And you can already see the problems that arise with this, right? Now, I mean, what people often overlook, though, because again, yes, that can be a problem in conversation between and one or two neurotypical people and one neurodivergent person. But what people often overlook is just what a sign of affection and info dump is among people on the spectrum. When you're talking to someone else who is neurodivergent or autistic or in any way neurodivergent and has a similar mind as you, info dumping is almost a surreally beautiful experience. You're going on about something you're fascinated by with someone who knows what that's like and has their own thing to info dump with you. You can learn so much and teach so much through an info dump session. One of my friends that I've recently made through autistic self-advocacy taught me all about facilitated communication. That's something I'm going to do a video on as well. I'm going to talk to them about that because I really do think it's something worth mentioning. But anyway, this friend of mine, they taught me all about facilitated communication, and likewise, I talked all about other interests I had when it came to self-advocacy with each other in massive Facebook message info dump texts. And it was glorious because we had something mutually shared that we shared with each other. And it's an extreme form of sharing, yes, but it's a form of sharing the love and showing others the things that we're interested in and hopefully having them share something with us. It's an info dump session is one of my favorite parts of being on the spectrum, and I will not even regret saying that. It's absolutely true. It's something I wish more people could experience. Moving on, though, I mean, you can see how both sides communicate quite well with each other, but they don't necessarily know how to communicate between them. So what can we do about this, short of forcing autistic individuals to mask and learn how to speak neurotypical, which is the current way of the world? I think, going off of my comment about culture earlier, that we have to start looking at autism less as a communication deficit and more as an entirely different culture born of the biological realities of our neurodivergent brains. So the gray matter gave us these inclinations, but it's become a culture in and of itself, and it should be viewed that way with the same respect. The fact is, very seldom do autistic people have difficulty communicating between themselves. Like I said, it's only when neurotypicals, when autistics and muggles, and yes, I went there, I'm a huge Harry Potter nerd, Gryffindor for life, are put in a situation where they have to communicate with each other that problems arise, like I keep saying. Really, both sides need to learn how to speak each other's language. The only difference is we've been learning how to speak neurotypical this whole time, while the opposite, that is to say, neurotypicals learning how to speak neurodivergent, is only just starting to happen. And it still has a long way to go. We need to meet in the middle and help each other learn each other's languages. Which, incidentally, is exactly what happened in the Darmok episode I was talking about earlier with Picard and the Temerian captain. Picard eventually pieced together that the meaning behind the Temerian's metaphors, or what the meaning was behind the Temerian's metaphors, and eventually began to be able to talk to the alien captain more effectively. That man, for his part, also did the same, and as he lay on his deathbed after their fierce battle with the monster earlier, he asked Jean-Luc to tell him a story from human mythology so that he could better understand humanity and our way of talking, because Jean-Luc had done that for him. So Captain Picard settled on the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh and Enkidu at Uruk, Captain Picard said as he softly as he looked down at his dying counterpart. As an aside, I'm not faking an English accent for this, no matter how much I want to, because imitating Captain Picard would be hilarious, but I'm just going to screw it up. Anyway, the man looked back up at him and smiled, gasping as he repeated to himself one last time before his consciousness faded. Gilgamesh and Enkidu at Uruk. Neurodivergent and neurotypical at mutual understanding. Live long and prosper, everyone. If you like this video and want to see more content by me at Differently Wired, remember to like, subscribe, and share this video on all social media. Also, you can find a link to my Patreon down below, and I'd really love if you continue to support me like you have with the last two videos. You guys rock, like I said, and I really look forward to making more content for you guys. So until next time, keep it neurodivergent, folks.